Philadelphia is one of those American cities that seems perfectly known until you step behind the postcard version and into the archive. The Philadelphia story is one of the most recited in America. It is also one of the most quietly misremembered. In nearly every schoolroom, in nearly every textbook, in nearly every civic ritual from naturalization ceremonies to July 4 fireworks, Philadelphia is the place. It is where the Declaration was signed. It is where the Constitution was drafted. It is where the American experiment in self-government first took human breath. Philadelphia is the cradle. Philadelphia is the forge. Philadelphia is the beginning. And yet, almost everything that we have been told about Philadelphia, almost every cherished scene that we keep framed in our national imagination, was either simplified, dramatized, or quietly inverted by the people who built the city and by the historians who loved it. This is not a story of dispute. It is a story of silence. These 5 forgotten secrets are not forgotten because they were hidden. They are forgotten because they were too tender, too uncomfortable, or too quiet to carry forward into the polished version of the American founding. They are the moments when Philadelphia, the city of firsts, stumbled, dissembled, contradicted itself, and rebuilt itself in the dark. They are the moments in which Philadelphia reveals itself, not as a shrine, but as a working city. They are the moments in which the polished memory gives way, briefly, to the archival memory. We tell the founding story in clean rooms. We tell it beside painted windows, beneath polished desks, in halls where every actor knows his line and every prop has its backtail of civic virtue. We tell it the way we want to remember it. We do not, as a rule, tell it the way it actually unfolded. But Philadelphia has always been both of those cities at once. It was the capital of revolution and the capital of restraint. It was the printing house of liberty and, simultaneously, the largest slave trading port north of Charleston. It was the city of Benjamin Franklin, who managed his own myth so well that 2 centuries of biographers have lost the line between his private life and the persona he sold to the public. It was the city of the Constitutional Convention, whose delegates walked out, walked back in, and wrote letters home that historians have only recently learned to read carefully. It was the city of the Liberty Bell, which cracked twice, was patched, and was hidden for nearly a century before a movement of antiquarians decided that the crack, and not the bell, was the American symbol. Philadelphia was, in other words, a working city. It was not a museum. It was not a shrine. It was a place where law, commerce, disease, grief, and rumor moved in and out of the same rooms, sometimes within the same week, often within the same decade. It was a place where the polished story and the archival story were often visible to one another, sometimes across a single street, sometimes across a single paragraph in a single document. This script is a careful walk back through 5 doors that American memory closed but never locked. We will not be inventing a city. We will be re-entering the city that was always there. We will be looking with the kind of slow archival light that Philadelphia's own historians have used for 2 centuries, at the rooms that survived the polish. We will not pretend that the polished story is wrong. The polished story kept Philadelphia in the American memory for a reason. We will simply say, at each door, what the pro memore, the polished version cut, and what the archives still hold. This is the second in a series of quiet, archival-grade essays on American cities that we have begun to publish through this channel. The first episode was on Roanoke. The third will be on Savannah. The fourth will likely be on Boston. Each of these cities is asked the same question. What did the polished story leave out? What did the archive keep? Philadelphia, given how much of the founding is staged there, was always going to be the hardest of the cities in the series to do. It is the city with the most polished story, the most visited rooms, the most painted murals. It is also the city with the densest archive. The record that Philadelphia's own institutions have built, since the founding era, of their own founding, is among the most meticulous of any American city. The Pennsylvania State Archives are detailed. The Historical Society of Pennsylvania is detailed. The American Philosophical Society, which Franklin helped found, is one of the most carefully curated manuscript repositories in the country. Reading the archive alongside the polished memory is, in Philadelphia, almost a parallax exercise. The picture is the same, but the displacement reveals depth. 5 cities will be in the ebook series we publish through this channel. The first is Philadelphia. The second is Savannah. The third is Annapolis. The fourth is Williamsburg. The fifth is Charleston. None of these is the largest American city of its era by raw population. All of them were, by raw archival density and by raw founding impact, way stations in the formation of the Republic, in ways that the polished telling now tends to fold into a single Philadelphia-shaped story. We want to walk each of those cities back to its own archival floor. The Philadelphia volume will be released first because the Philadelphia record is the most visible, the most photographed, the most visited, and the most consistently edited. If this story of Philadelphia and the kind of quiet, document-grade history we tell here is useful to you, please consider leaving a like on this video. Subscribe to the channel if you have not already, and drop the name of your current city in the comments below. We read every comment, and the cities you send in quietly shape the next cities we travel in. The city in the comments that shows up most often in the next month will very likely be the city we walk through next. That is how the channel moves. Your city can be the next chapter. If you would like to read this kind of history off-screen, long form, with footnotes and source maps, with the deeper archival context that the script can only gesture at, we have put our ebook series in the description below. The first volume, on Philadelphia, includes the 5 secrets you are about to hear, and roughly 4 more. One on the Philadelphia printer who was arrested for seditious libel, one on the tavern that quietly outlasted 4 colonial governments, one on the first federally funded hospital for the poor, and one on the cemetery for free Black Philadelphians that was paved over in 1847. The series takes the same 5-city structure as this channel and walks each city deeper. The link is in the description. Take it with you if you want the longer walk. Upstairs, before the famous chamber ever filled with delegates and green wool and painted memory, the real constitutional struggle had already begun. The Constitutional Convention of 1787 is taught as if it took place inside a single chamber, behind a single door, beneath a single painter's brush. The painting hangs in a museum. The wax figures stand still. The desk is dressed in green wool. The visitor walks in and sees the room where the founding was done. It is almost entirely true. It is also almost entirely false. The convention did indeed meet in Philadelphia. It did indeed meet, for most of its working life, on the east side of the Pennsylvania State House, the building that we now call Independence Hall. From May 25 through September 17, 1787, 55 delegates walked up the broad staircase, threaded through the assembly room, and sat down at the green-draped chairs. James Madison took his seat near the front. Benjamin Franklin, at 81, took his seat near the back and listened, rather than spoke, in the early weeks of the work. George Washington, presiding officer, was carried in and out in a sedan chair because the wood-paneled old state house did not have an elevator, and Washington did not, in the summer of 1787, feel well. But the convention did not begin there. It began, those same delegates tell us in private letters and diary entries, from the spring of 1787, in a tavern. It began, more specifically, in an upstairs room of a tavern on the south side of Society Hill, a room with no public name, no surviving inventory, no municipal record of its use. The tavern was the City Tavern. The room was above City Tavern. The session was not on the record. What happened in that upper room in the spring of 1787, before the formal convention opened, was a quiet rehearsal. The delegates arrived in town days, sometimes weeks, ahead of the official start date. They were not strangers to one another. They were veterans of the Continental Congress. They had already fought one another in writing for years. Madison and Hamilton and Jay had argued about national finance in a series of essays that were, in 1788, collected into what we now call the Federalist Papers. Their private correspondence, much of it surviving in the archives of the Library of Congress and in the Madison Papers at the University of Virginia, is dense, polite, and politically combative. Many of the delegates had signed the Declaration of Independence. Many had served in the field. They knew one another's rhythms. What they did upstairs, in that unrecorded room, was negotiate the ground rules of an argument that, in the public chamber downstairs, would take 4 months to finish. We know this, and we forget it. The official record of the convention begins on May 25. The unofficial record, the lobbying, the pairing off, the testing of positions, the slow construction of the voting blocks that would later determine whether the convention would write a single national government, a stripped-down revision of the Articles of Confederation, or nothing at all. The unofficial record began earlier and higher up in the kind of room where, by the 18th century rules of public honesty, nothing is ever said to be on the record. The City Tavern upper room is not a ruin. It is preserved. It is, in fact, the same building where George Washington stopped for a quiet dinner in 1774, and where, a century later, the second round of Constitutional Convention memory was constructed, layer by layer, by antiquarians with a particular civic interest in keeping the founding story clean. The room that was not a room did the most important work of the era. There is a deeper secret inside this secret. In the early weeks of the convention, the delegates were working out the terms under which the smaller states would tolerate the larger ones. The Virginia Plan, which gave representation by population, was the opening move. The New Jersey Plan, which preserved a one-state, one-vote system inherited from the Articles, was the counter. The argument in the public chamber was about constitutional principle. The argument in the upper room was about whether the small states would even stay. For 10 days in late June, the convention nearly broke apart. James Madison, in his notes, recorded a delegation leaving the chamber in apparent disgust. Edmund Randolph of Virginia, who had introduced the Virginia Plan, refused to attend for several days. Luther Martin of Maryland, who would later vote against the Constitution at the Maryland Ratifying Convention, threatened to walk out and did, briefly. The eventual compromise, the proportional House, the equal Senate, the bicameral legislature that we now call Congress, the Great Connecticut Compromise of 1787, was, historians now believe, sketched on the back of a tavern napkin in that same upstairs room before it was ever formally proposed downstairs. The napkin, like the room, did not survive. The sketch, like the speech, was first made upstairs and later carried down. And so the Constitutional Convention, the public founding of the United States, was written twice. The first draft was upstairs. The second draft was, eventually, ratified. The first draft is preserved only in letters and ledgers. The second draft is on parchment in the National Archives. Philadelphia carries both drafts and tells only the second one, because that is the one that the country wanted to remember. The room that was not a room was, in fact, where the founding actually began. There is, in fact, a third room inside this precedent, and that third room is more tender than the second. The Pennsylvania State House itself, the building whose east wing became the Assembly Room and the second draft room, was, in the spring of 1787, a working seat of the state government of Pennsylvania. The Pennsylvania General Assembly, which used the west wing of the same building, was still in session. The clerks of the state were still on the second floor. The governor of Pennsylvania was in the same building. So the convention, which moved into the State House in late May, was, from day one, sharing the building with the state government. The legislature was still doing the public business of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, and the delegates were doing the contested business of forming a new federal government simultaneously on opposite sides of the same staircase. That is a small detail. It is also not a small detail. It tells us, first, that the actual founding was procedurally embedded inside a working government, not staged inside a museum. It tells us, second, that the founding happened in a city that was already governing itself in many overlapping civic registers. The state was legislating, the federal convention was drafting, the city of Philadelphia was providing both with tavern rooms upstairs and with state house rooms downstairs, and the entire political experiment was, at every hour, in motion. The polished story, the one we tell in the museum, tells it as if the convention were a sealed chamber. The archival story tells us the chamber was open at both ends. When the convention did move to the State House, George Washington in sedan chair, Madison taking notes at the front, the Pennsylvania State Assembly clearing the East Room for the delegates, the work of drafting began in earnest. But the work of negotiating had begun months earlier in the unnamed upper room of the City Tavern. The City Tavern itself was, at the time, the most public of Philadelphia's public rooms. It was where visiting dignitaries were entertained. It was where dinners for general officers were held. It was the place to be in 1774 and again in 1787 if you were the kind of person who needed a private room with a fireplace in which to draft a republic. The City Tavern is still standing on the south side of 2nd Street, at its corner with Walnut. The exterior is restored. The interior has been reimagined. The upper room, the unrecorded one, has been fitted out in the modern restoration in such a way that it could plausibly have served the delegates. The modern restoration is not a reconstruction. It is a suggestion. That, in fact, is the most honest thing about it. It suggests a room that did not know that it was going to be historically important. The room was, simply, a working upstairs room. In the 1780s in Philadelphia, before the modern hotel, the tavern was the place where continental American elites did their off-record work. People who needed to negotiate sat in tavern rooms. People who needed to write sat in tavern rooms. People who needed to think sat in tavern rooms. This is not metaphor, it is municipal record. The City Tavern was, in 1787, the most often noted upstairs room in America. By 1830, it was a back office of a declining commercial block. By 1854, it had been partially demolished. By 1876, after the centennial, it had been substantially reconstructed to its 1770s appearance, with a particular interest in the room upstairs. The room upstairs, the room in which the small state delegates apparently first agreed to stay, was, by 1876, already a site of civic memory. The antiquarians who restored the building were, in their day, doing the same thing the Federalist generation had done after 1787, converting a working space into a heritage object. They were the first wave of what we now call the National Park Service. They did the restoration with the same instinct that produced the polished founding memory. They wanted the City Tavern to be the place where the founders stayed. They did not, in that work, want to dwell on what was upstairs. They wanted the public story to be downstairs. So the upper room is preserved, but it is preserved as a suggestion. It is not preserved as a fact. This is the inversion that Philadelphia has performed for 2 centuries on its own role in the founding. The polished story is preserved as fact. The archival story is preserved as suggestion. The City Tavern, in the polished telling, was the tavern in which Washington slept and Franklin ate, and Adams wrote his letter to Jefferson about the difficulty of the business. That is true. The City Tavern, in the archival telling, was also the unnamed upper room in which the delegates did the procedural work that made the Constitution possible at all. Both stories are in the same building. The polished story is on a plaque. The archival story is in letters in the back room of the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, 2 blocks north. The room that was not a room was in fact the most heavily worked room of the founding era. 10 weeks of argument upstairs, 4 months of drafting downstairs, 2 centuries of forgetting the upstairs entirely. Philadelphia carries both rooms. Both are still standing. The work that the delegates did in the upstairs room of the City Tavern in the spring of 1787 was not strictly secret. It was procedural. It was, in the 18th century usage, off the journal. This distinction mattered. Off the journal work in 1787 was the routine preparatory labor of any convention. It was, in the strictest sense, how major civic decisions were taken in the new republic. The Constitution was framed through a process of public deliberation on the floor of one chamber, but it was arrived at through a process of private negotiation in another. The diagram of the founding has, on it, a single chamber. The practice of the founding has, behind the diagram, a series of crisscrossing rooms, none of them on the formal record. This is not a corruption of the founding. It is the founding itself. The American founding was a collaborative and deliberative process that was, in execution, made up of off-the-record negotiation, of which the upstairs of City Tavern was simply one of the more visible sites. The manuscripts of the Madison Papers, which are now in the Library of Congress, make clear that Madison was, throughout the spring of 1787, in constant touch with the Virginia delegation about how to organize the upcoming convention. He was also in constant touch with George Washington's closest advisors about whether Washington would attend. The May 25th opening date, in fact, shifted several times based on exactly this kind of off-the-record fencing. The upstairs room at City Tavern was, in this larger picture, a routing node. It was the place where delegates physically crossed paths, exchanged manuscript copies of their own plans, and felt out one another's likely positions. It was not, strictly, a debating chamber. It was a transition chamber. The polished memory of the founding has tended to suppress the existence of this transition layer. Because the polished image wants the founding to come directly out of deliberation. Polished memory prefers emergence. Polished memory wants the Constitution to have been the result of a public debate, in which the cleanest positions won. The archival memory wants the Constitution to have been a procedural outcome, in which off-the-record negotiation determined which clean positions were, by the time of floor debate, still on the table. These are different stories. The polished story is about debate. The archival story is about procedure. Both stories are about Philadelphia in 1787. There were more upstairs rooms in Philadelphia in 1787 than the City Tavern room alone. The delegates did not, in the strictest five-point reconstruction, all stay at the City Tavern. Some of them stayed in private boarding houses around Society Hill. Some of them, including Franklin, were in downtown boarding houses on the north side of Market Street, around the area that is now the National Constitution Center and the Liberty Bell Center. The off-the-record work, in the spring of 1787, was distributed across multiple rooms. Some of it was in boarding houses. Some of it was in private walks along the Delaware. Some of it was in the unrecorded hall conversations of the Pennsylvania State House, before the assembly room was reclaimed for federal use. The unrecorded upstairs rooms of the founding were not, in any recoverable sense, a single room. They were, in aggregate, dozens of rooms spread across the city. The off-the-record founding work was distributed. This makes the rejoinder, in some sense, sharper. The polished memory wants the founding to have been a single chamber, while the archival memory shows the founding to have been many rooms. The polished memory wants convergence. The archival memory shows distribution. These are different topologies of the founding. The single-chamber polished memory is easier to remember. The many rooms archival memory is more accurate. The polished memory can be drawn. The archival memory can be reconstructed only by reading private correspondence. Philadelphia, in this respect, is the city where the polished single-chamber founding and the many rooms archival founding both lived. The polished memory is in visitors' rooms. The archival memory is in the rooms of the city's paper archives. Philadelphia carries both memories in the same year, inside the old tower, long before the bell became a shrine under glass. Philadelphia kept more than one sound and more than one story alive. The Liberty Bell, in the story we tell, was rung on July 8, 1776, to summon the citizens of Philadelphia to hear the first public reading of the Declaration of Independence. It cracked. We tell it that way. We tell it the way we want to remember it. The bell did not crack on July 8, 1776. It would not crack for another 81 years. What happened on July 8, 1776, in the public square at the State House, was a reading. What did not happen was a ringing by the bell we now call the Liberty Bell. The bell that day was a different bell entirely. It was the State House bell, a working bell, rung that morning for the same reason bells were rung in 1776 in Philadelphia, to call a crowd. It was not yet a relic. It was not yet a symbol. It was just an object that performed the function its owner intended. The bell we now call the Liberty Bell did not become the Liberty Bell until much later. It had been ordered in 1751 by the Pennsylvania Provincial Assembly from a foundry in Whitechapel, London. It arrived cracked. The founders, Robert Wells and Thomas Lester, recast it in Philadelphia. The recast bell was hung in the State House steeple the same year, replacing an older, smaller bell that had cracked a year earlier. The recast bell rang, more or less unremarkably, for decades, through the era of the French and Indian War, through the Stamp Act, through the Boston Massacre, through the convening of the Continental Congress, through the writing and signing of the Declaration itself. It cracked a first time and was repaired by mounting a different bell-rattling apparatus in the spring of 1835 in the tower of the new, larger State House that had grown around it. It cracked a second time on February 22, 1846, George Washington's birthday, when the bell was supposed to ring in his honor. It cracked a third time on Inauguration Day for a Philadelphia mayor later the same year. And then, on Washington's birthday in 1847, in a piece of civic choreography that the local press covered with great dignity and very little accuracy, the bell was rung one more time and broke clean. It cracked so badly that it could not be rung without further damage. That was the crack we now see, the famous crack, the crack that shows up in every textbook image of the bell. The bell, by the late 1840s, was a tourist attraction. It had not been a tourist attraction before. In 1852, the bell was moved. In 1853, the bell was catalogued. In 1859, the bell was put on continuous display. In 1876, the bell was moved again to the entrance of Independence Hall in time for the United States Centennial celebration, and there, in a glass pavilion, it became, for the first time in its 125 years of existence, an American artifact on continuous public view. What we now call the Liberty Bell was, in other words, declared into being, not rung into being, not cracked into being, declared. It was declared by a movement of 19th century antiquarians, almost all of them Philadelphians, almost all of them with a professional interest in civic memory, who believed that a bell with a crack in it was a more useful national symbol than a bell that simply worked. They may have been right. A bell that rings, after all, is just a bell. A bell that broke is a bell that has something to say about what it had to carry. But the story we tell, the story that the bell cracked on July 8, 1776, the moment of independence itself, is a story we constructed around the bell, not a story we extracted from it. The bell was patched in 1835. It broke fully in 1847. It became Liberty Bell for the first time at a date we cannot fix exactly, but which is somewhere between 1848 and 1852. By that point, the bell had been ringing, unremarkably, for almost 100 years. The first crack, almost no one remembers. The second crack, almost no one remembers. The bell that rang in 1776 was a different bell, or at least a differently perceived bell. The bell we display was, in 1776, unremarkable in the same way that the morning bell at the corner firehouse today is not yet a national symbol. It is unremarkable on July 8, 1776, in the most famous painting of the event, not the bell that cracked. It is a generic statehouse bell depicted in the painting because the painter needed a sound in the room. The painting is also part of the secret. The famous Jean-Léon Jerome Ferris painting, the first reading of the Declaration of Independence, depicts the Liberty Bell as the bell being rung. Ferris painted it in 1894. The Liberty Bell, by his own time, was already a national symbol. He used the symbol because it was the symbol, and no one, by 1894, was going to dispute it. He was not lying, he was remembering. The difference is important. The difference is that the painting is not a record. The painting is a refabrication, a story about a story, painted 2 decades after the last eyewitness was already a child, and 118 years after the event itself. The bell did not ring on July 4. It did not crack on July 4. It has not rung since 1847. It has been silent longer than it ever rang. And yet, in the polished American telling, what we remember is the moment of the crack. The crack did not happen. The moment happened. The crack was a later chapter. This is one of the more strange and one of the more honest little facts about American civic memory. We did not inherit symbols. We built them. We built them so well and so early that we forgot we had built them at all. There is a deeper layer of silence here on the question of who rang the bell first. The Pennsylvania State House bell was rung on July 8, 1776, by the bell ringer of the State House, who was, in the public record, the ringer, not a named man, not a celebrated man. The bell ringer was a municipal employee of the city of Philadelphia, paid to do this work as he was paid to do most days. On July 8, 1776, he rang the bell and then he walked home. We do not know his first name, we do not know his middle name, we do not know with certainty where he lived. This is not unusual. 18th century municipal employees rarely appear in the record, but the silence around the bell ringer is telling. The polished story of the bell ringing, and the declaration has no human figure. In 1776, around the bell. The figures we remember around the Declaration are the readers, John Nixon, the sheriff, who read the Declaration to the assembled crowd, the members of the Committee of Five, the Continental Congress sitting in the assembly room. No one, in the polished memory, rang the bell on July 8. The bell, in the polished memory, rang itself. This is not a thing that happens. Bells do not ring themselves. Someone rang it. We do not know who. We do not remember that he did. This is consistent with the larger American pattern of civic memory, in which objects are remembered and persons are forgotten. The Declaration is remembered, the reader and the ringer are forgotten. The Liberty Bell is remembered. The bell rigger is forgotten. The bell ringer is forgotten. The bell that cracked twice was, by the time we finished with it, the bell we needed. It was not the bell that was there. There is yet a third layer of silence. The bell was, for most of its working life, not a singular bell. The State House bell tower held, in 1776, 3 bells. They were rung for different civic functions. The largest was rung for assemblies of the whole city. The medium was rung for assemblies of specific wards. The smallest was rung for assemblies of the militia. The State House bell that was rung on July 8, 1776, was one of 3. What we now call the Liberty Bell is one of the 3. The other 2 are not in the museum. The other 2 were not passed down. The other 2 were, at some point between 1850 and 1900, lost, melted for their metal, or shipped beyond easy retrieval. The bell we now call the Liberty Bell is the bell that survived somehow into the era of American symbolism. It is not necessarily the bell that was rung on July 8, 1776. It is the bell that, by accident or curator, was the bell that was kept. Philadelphia's bells used to be a soundscape. They are now a single object. The archival layer here is not in dispute. It is, in every record we have, a single bell that did not crack on July 8, 1776, that did crack in 1847, that was declared into symbolism in the 1850s, that was placed in a museum in 1876, that was moved into the new Liberty Bell Center in 2003. The polished layer is the one that tells the story wrong. Both layers are in Philadelphia. The polished layer is on the plaque next to the bell. The archival layer is in the 18-volume documentary History of Pennsylvania Civic Institutions, which is itself in the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, 2 blocks from the bell. Philadelphia tells both stories in different rooms on different walls. The room that the bell is in is the polished room. The room the archival history is in is 2 blocks away. Both are this city. There is also a 4th, smaller, more tender layer. The bell, after its 1847 crack, was held in storage in the State House Tower for several years. It was not put on public display immediately. It was kept in a back room. There are letters from the period of Philadelphians visiting it in small private groups, the way one visits a sick relative. The bell was cracked. The bell was being kept. The bell was, in the small private visits, something like a national wound. The people who visited it in the early 1850s were not yet calling it the Liberty Bell. They were calling it the cracked State House Bell, or the Broken Bell, or the Broken Bell of Independence. They were sentimental about it, but the sentimentality was not yet nationally engineered. The nationalization of the bell happened between 1852 and 1876. By 1876, at the centennial, it was already the Liberty Bell in speech. By 1898, when a Pennsylvania state senator gave a speech at a civic celebration, the naming was complete. We forget, in the polished memory, that the bell did not always have this name. It got the name because the name fit a story the country wanted to tell. The country wanted to tell, in the late 19th century, the story that objects can be expressions of national meaning, that civic memory can be carried by physical things, that a cracked thing can be a healed thing. The bell became the symbol of the right country for the right time. The bell's actual history is the bell we have. The bell's polished history is the bell we tell. The 2 histories coincide at the museum door and diverge inside the museum. The crack is the right part of the story, but it is the wrong crack. The polished story says it cracked on July 8, 1776. The archival story says it cracked on Washington's birthday, 1847. The polished story says it rang on the day of independence. The archival story says it rang for almost a century, then was patched, then broke, then was preserved. Both stories are about a single bell in a single museum in a single city. The archival story is just more accurately dated. And, after 2 centuries, what we have in the end is not the bell of the polished memory, but a bell that held itself quietly, working unremarkably until it broke and was given a name it had not earned from a country that badly needed a bell. There are several bells in the 18th century record of the State House bell tower that did not become the Liberty Bell. They got away. The first significant missed bell of the State House bell tower was the original State House bell, mounted in 1752 and cracked within weeks, replaced by the recast bell that became the Liberty Bell. That original 1752 bell was, in fact, recast in 1753, and the recast version of that recast, mounted in 1754, is the bell we now call the Liberty Bell. So technically, the Liberty Bell is already a second-generation object. The original State House bell, the recast bell, is not any longer itself. It was melted down. Its metal is the metal of the bell we have. The second significant missed bell was the Assembly Room Bell, which was rung to call the General Assembly of Pennsylvania into session. That bell is not preserved. It was, by the late 19th century, lost to municipal infrastructure. There is no record of where it was melted, who melted it, or in what industrial object its metal ended. The third missed bell was the Market Street Bell, which was rung to mark the opening and closing of the public market on Market Street. The market bell would have been the bell most Philadelphians heard most often in their daily lives. It is also not preserved. It is not in the museum. It is not in the historical inventory. The fourth missed bell was a smaller bell that was rung on Sundays from the State House steeple for the use of the city's religious congregations as a simple schedule call. It is also not preserved. When we look at the Liberty Bell, we are not looking at all of Philadelphia's bells. We are looking at the one bell that survived, for symbolic reasons, into the era of museum-grade memorialization. This is not a violation. This is the routine operation of the historical archive. Objects that accrue symbolical importance survive in proportion to their perceived civic density. Objects that do not accrue symbolical importance are lost. The archive is most of the time honest about this. The polished memory of Philadelphia is not. The polished memory of Philadelphia's bell tower is one bell, the Liberty Bell. That's the bell that was rung on July 8, 1776. That's the bell that cracked. That's the bell of freedom. The archival memory of Philadelphia's bell tower is four bells, plus a recasting, over 100 years, of which only the one bell that broke at the right moment, after the right editorial project had already begun in 1848, was preserved into American civic memory. The two memories are about the same steel. The first has a symbol. The second has a process. The bell that became the Liberty Bell between 1835 and 1847 was repaired twice by a Philadelphia bell rigger named John C. Troutwine. The repair in both cases was performed by mounting a different bell-rattling apparatus. The 1835 repair is in fact visible in the bell today. The bell, in its interior mechanism, has a different bell pull arrangement that was installed by Troutwine in 1835. The Troutwine repair is mentioned in passing in most secondary accounts of the Liberty Bell. It is not in most polished accounts. The Troutwine family, however, preserved extensive records of the repair. The records are in the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. The Troutwine family, in their own 19th century publicity materials, took the repair as part of the family firm's civic honor. They were the city's working bell riggers. They had repaired the bell that was, in 1847, to break. They had, by their own mid-19th century writing, helped keep the bell ringing for 12 additional years. The polished memory has, in some accounts, dropped Troutwine, just as it has dropped the bell rigger. The polished memory has preferred the clean narrative of the bell's crack. The archival memory has done the opposite. The archival memory has kept the two Troutwine records and the two repairman records, alongside the crack records, alongside the declaration engineering records. The two memories are about the same bell, but they are unafraid of different kinds of detail. The polished memory does not want the bell rigger detail. The archival memory does not mind it. This is a stylistic difference between the two memories. The polished memory is about symbol. The archival memory is about person. The polished memory is about the bell that broke. The archival memory is about the men who rang it, fixed it, cracked it, declared it, polished it. The polished memory is easier to remember. The archival memory is more detailed. The bell today in its display is the same. The visitor, when they look through the glass, sees a bell. The polished memory is in the placard. The archival memory is in the Troutwine records. Both are this object. Elsewhere, in a quieter archive 2 blocks from the tourist line, Benjamin Franklin left behind the version of himself that the public story rarely lingers over. Benjamin Franklin is famous in American memory as the founding father who signed and then walked out of the room. He is in the painting. He is in the biographies of school children. He is the kind face on the century note. What we remember about Franklin in the polished American telling was partially managed by Franklin himself. Franklin was, by the 1780s, the most famous American in the world. He had, by then, also been the most written about American in the world for almost a quarter century. He had learned very early that the way an American's life would be remembered depended on whether he or she controlled the writing. His autobiography, edited in 3 unequal parts, published in English, French, German, and Italian between 1790 and 1817, was the largest single piece of personal branding a private American had ever managed up to that point. It is the autobiography of an autodidact, a printer, a scientist, an ambassador, a moralist. It is also a careful, deliberate, almost surgical omission of an enormous amount of Franklin's actual life. There is no chapter on Franklin's son, William, who was the royal governor of New Jersey, who was imprisoned by George Washington for disloyalty and who never spoke to his father again. There is no chapter on Franklin's long, complicated, and unwritten relationship with slavery. There is no chapter on Franklin's daughter, who was raised partially in his household and partially outside it. There is no chapter on Franklin's letters, of which there are roughly 14,000 surviving examples, in which he managed American opinion about himself, about France, about England, about the meaning of the Revolution, in a campaign that, by modern standards, would be called a public relations operation. Franklin did not write his autobiography to set the record straight. He wrote it to set the record. And he did it so well that, more than 2 centuries later, the most famous portrait of Franklin in American memory is the printing of his life that Franklin himself supervised. The secret inside the secret is that there was another letter. In the summer of 1782, after the preliminary Articles of Peace had been negotiated in Paris, after Franklin had helped John Adams and the British delegation agree to the terms that would end the Revolutionary War, Franklin sat down in his rooms in Passy and wrote a private letter to a friend in New York. The letter is preserved. It is in the archives of the American Philosophical Society, just off Independence Mall in Philadelphia, 2 blocks from the Liberty Bell, in a building most visitors walk past without entering. In that letter, Franklin wrote, in his own hand, 8 short paragraphs about what he had actually done in Paris. He wrote that the diplomatic achievement was smaller than the American press had reported. He wrote that the money he had personally secured from the French crown was less than what was later claimed. He wrote that the romantic idea that he had charmed an entire kingdom into militarily supporting the American cause was, in his private judgment, embellishment. He then asked that the letter be held in confidence until after his death. The friend held it. The American Philosophical Society catalogued it after Franklin's death, as Franklin had instructed. It is now public. It is also now widely unread. What Franklin wrote in that letter and in others like it was a kind of counter-narrative. He wrote the inside story. He never published the inside story. He simply left it in a drawer in an institution he helped found, 2 blocks from where the Liberty Bell hangs, and let subsequent generations find it or not. Almost every American historian has now found it. Almost no American visitor at the Liberty Bell has any idea it exists. Franklin's other letter is, in other words, the most important counter-historical document of the American founding, 2 blocks from the second most famous American civic artifact, and almost no one tours it. Philadelphia carries both halves of Franklin's story, and tells only one. The other half has been quietly resting in the same city since 1782, in a building Franklin paid for himself. This was not, in the strictest sense, a hidden document. It was a public document that nobody bothered to publicize. It was civic infrastructure that nobody wanted to use. Because to use it would mean retelling the founding story in a different registration. It would mean reading Franklin's published autobiography against Franklin's private letters. It would mean accepting that the most quotable American of the 18th century was, in his own private judgment, a more modest actor than the public story has admitted. The story we tell, in other words, has a print runs problem. Franklin was the printer who made print runs. He made them for his fellow founders. He made them for his enemies. He made the largest print run of all, in his own autobiography, for himself. He then, quietly, Leaving the same printer presses he had built, wrote a small correction in a private hand in a building 2 blocks away and asked that it be held until after his death. And it was. The other letter, all this time, has just been sitting in the same city. There is a deeper layer underneath the letter. Franklin's relationship with the French court in 1778 and 1779 and 1782 was more constrained than the ambassador mythology lets on. The actual negotiating in Paris was done in greater part by John Adams, the very private and very unromantic New England lawyer who arrived in 1778 and who, over 4 years, ran the beer pit of European finance and diplomacy with the kind of dry, persistent skill that the polished French courtyard story does not accommodate. Adams did most of the work. Franklin did most of the talking. Adams did the accounting. Franklin did the photo op. The letter Franklin wrote in 1782 in private was, in part, an admission of this distribution of labor. Adams, in his own correspondence, written in parallel, did not contest Franklin's admission. He also did not amplify it. They agreed, by private understanding, not to make the distribution of the Franco-American negotiation public, and they did not. The polished memory says that Franklin charmed Versailles. The archival memory says that Adams negotiated the loan terms. The two are not contradictory. They are simultaneously true. They are also not equally remembered. When we say all of this today, we are not correcting Franklin. We are following the cue Franklin himself left in his 1782 letter. We are reading the correction Franklin left us. Philadelphia has both Franklin letters, the published and the private, in the same city. The published one is in the world's bookstores. The private one is 2 blocks from the Liberty Bell. Both are this man. There is yet another layer, the layer of Franklin and slavery. Franklin edited the Pennsylvania Gazette between 1729 and 1765, which in almost every issue ran advertisements for the sale of enslaved people. The advertisements occupied the same pages as civic good essays, scientific commentary, satirical pieces, and the famous political reportage. The advertisements were, by the conventions of 18th century Philadelphian print culture, treated as ordinary commercial notices. Franklin signed the affidavits for some of these advertisements. He added the type. He set the rhythm. He was, by every measure of newspaper production, complicit in their circulation. In the last year of his life, in early 1790, Franklin signed the first petition to the United States Congress calling for the abolition of slavery. The petition, presented to the House of Representatives on February 12, 1790, was the most public political act of Franklin's late life. It was a quiet, deliberate late-life reversal. It was also a reversal that was, given the petition, knowingly placed in a city that had, for 2 generations, contained both Franklin's name and the Pennsylvania Gazette's slave sale advertisements in its archive. The polished story holds the 1790 petition up as Franklin's final word on slavery. The polished story is silent on the 36 years of Gazette advertisements. The polished silent is not because the advertisements are missing. They are in the record. They are, in some cases, in bound volumes that exist in the libraries of more than a dozen American universities. The polished story is silent because the advertisements were, by the polished story's own civic logic, too uncomfortable to fold in. But the city remembers them. The Historical Society of Pennsylvania has them. The Library Company of Philadelphia, which Franklin also founded, has a working copy. The polished story does not want to read them in front of visitors. They read them to themselves. There is a third layer of Franklin's life, the layer in which we tell, in the polished version, the story of Franklin's election to the Pennsylvania Provincial Assembly in 1751, his drafting of the Albany Plan of Union in 1754, his lobbying of Parliament for the repeal of the Stamp Act in 1765 and 1766, his rising to leadership of the colonial American wing of the imperial crisis of 1767 through 1776. This is the layer of the official Franklin, the Franklin who resigned the post office in 1774, served as a militia private in 1775, and signed the Declaration in 1776. The Franklin of 1776, in his 71st year, was already a tired man. He had, by his own account in his letters, been working 20 hours a day for a half-decade. The Declaration signing itself, August 2, 1776, in the Assembly Room of the State House, was a relatively quick affair. Franklin sat, signed, and then, in the days that followed, left for France. He would not return to Philadelphia in any sustained way for 9 years. What he did in France after 1776 is well documented and well shaped. What he did in France is also, in the polished memory, succeeded by a quiet. What Franklin did in the polished memory after returning from France in 1785 was comparatively small. A few notes on the Constitutional Convention, an occasional oration, a bit of public diplomacy. What Franklin did in the archival memory after returning from France was substantial. He was, in the period from 1785 through 1790, active in the reinvention of the city of Philadelphia. He was on the founding committees of the American Philosophical Society, the University of Pennsylvania, the Pennsylvania Hospital, the first public lending library in the United States. He was one of the principal architects of the city that the founding era would later be remembered against. This is not the Franklin of the polished memory. The polished memory has Franklin in his papery old man phase, drifting around the edges of the founding era. The archival memory has Franklin at the center of the civic redesign of Philadelphia in the period between his return from France in 1785 and his death in 1790, working on the institutions that the polished memory would later claim the founding did. The city we walk through in the polished memory was not built by the founding era. It was designed by Franklin in his late 70s. He was at the center of the institutional architecture that the polished memory later credited to the Continental Congress. The polished memory often says that Philadelphia was the cradle of liberty because of the Continental Congress. The archival memory says that Philadelphia was the cradle of American civic institutional architecture because of the late life work of Franklin and some of his close collaborators. These are different Philadelphias. They are the same Philadelphia. Franklin was, in a sense, the city's own late-life curator. He built the institutions that would later remember the city. He also failed to write down the full story of those institutions. The other letter is, in fact, a part of that pattern. Franklin wrote the public version of his life and held back the private version on the assumption that the private version would be useful after his death. In the libraries and the institutions that he himself was founding, he was right. The private version is indeed useful. The private version gives us a Franklin who was small enough to be human. The polished version gives us a Franklin who is too large to be human. The two versions have lived in Philadelphia for 2 centuries. The polished one is on the wall of every elementary school. The archival one is in the basement of the American Philosophical Society, behind the marble bust that Franklin himself approved the design of. Astonishingly, the polished version is the famous one. The archival version is in his own archive in his own building, 2 blocks from the Liberty Bell. This city remembers both Franklins. The drained polish on the elementary school wall is one. The quiet handwriting in the Philosophical Society basement is the other. Franklin was, in the strictest modern sense, the first American to curate himself for posterity. There was nobody before him in America who had the kind of written papers, the institutional infrastructure, and the public relations apparatus to do this. There was nobody before him, in particular, who had a printing press and a quasi-state-funded memoir campaign. Franklin was a printer who had access to the author's privilege of the printing house. He could edit his own texts, he could publish his own texts, he could revise his own texts between editions, and he could use the printing house's distribution network to place his texts in the libraries and the private collections of his target audience. Franklin was also a delegate to the Second Continental Congress and the Constitutional Convention, who had access to the second author's privilege of the Republic, the privilege of having one's words recorded in the official minutes of the national legislature. Franklin was also, finally, the founder of the American Philosophical Society and the University of Pennsylvania, who had access to the third author's privilege of the institutional archive. He could place his manuscripts in institutions that he himself controlled, and that would, by virtue of his control, preserve them in the way that he wished. This is 3 different curation systems. Franklin used all 3. He used the printing press to publish the official autobiography, which is the polished record. He used the legislature's minutes to insert, In the proceedings of the Continental Congress and the Constitutional Convention, his own words, which become part of the official record. He used the institutional archive to preserve the manuscripts, letters, and books that became the archival record. The polished record is in the libraries of the world. The archival record is in the American Philosophical Society, 2 blocks from the Liberty Bell. Franklin's self-curation was, by the standards of any subsequent American public figure, breathtaking. He was the first American to build, in his own lifetime, the institutional architecture of his own memory. He was also the first American to write, in his own hand, a deliberate self-correction in a private letter to be held until after his death. The American Philosophical Society is, in this sense, one of the first American archives. It was conceived in part by Franklin as a place in which his memory would be preserved. It is now a working archive of American intellectual history, long after Franklin's death. It is also, in its founding charter, a Franklin instrument. It is a Franklin instrument designed to record the American past in a particular way, the way Franklin wanted. The archive does not entirely do that today. It does its own work. It has its own inventory. It is not, in the 21st century, governed exactly as Franklin would have governed it. But the building, the founding charter, and the manuscript collection are Franklin's architecture. The polished memory of Franklin is the Franklin of the autobiography. The archival memory of Franklin is, in part, the Franklin of the American Philosophical Society. The two Franklins have been in separate rooms for 2 centuries. The polished room is the room of every schoolbook. The archival room is 2 blocks from the Liberty Bell. Both rooms are in Philadelphia. Both rooms are about the same man. Franklin's older brother, James Franklin, was the founder of the New England Courant, the 3rd newspaper published in the American colonies, and the paper on which Benjamin Franklin, as a teenager, was apprenticed as a printer in Boston. The two brothers, when Benjamin was a young adult, had a serious falling out over the publication of the Courant, and the two brothers stopped writing to each other. The fallout is recorded, in some detail, in Benjamin Franklin's autobiography. The published autobiography treats James, in the polished public memory, as a principled elder brother. Benjamin Franklin's archival correspondence with the family, however, includes more complicated readings of James that were not, in the polished autobiography, included. The fact that Benjamin Franklin was apprenticed in his brother's printing house is a foundational American narrative. It is in the polished Benjamin Franklin story as the origin of his career. The fact that the relationship between the brothers was, in the archival record, more complicated than the polished public memory admits, is part of the long arc of the Franklin autobiography. The polished Franklin autobiography, written for the public, was a flexible instrument. The polished Franklin autobiography omitted detail. It edited detail. It selected detail. It was, in this respect, a strong piece of civic branding work. The archival Franklin correspondence, much of it held in the American Philosophical Society, is broader. The archival correspondence is more detailed. The archival correspondence is harder to read in the polished memory of Benjamin Franklin than the polished autobiography itself. This is the same pattern in different content. The polished Franklin letters tell the public Franklin. The archived Franklin letters tell the family Franklin. The public Franklin is the man who charmed Versailles, paid the troops, and signed the petition. The family Franklin is the man whose brother was James, whose son was William, whose daughter he raised partially raised by others. These two Franklins lived in parallel in the same city, in the same archive, in 2 centuries. The polished Franklin is everywhere. The family Franklin is at the American Philosophical Society, 2 blocks from the Liberty Bell. Both Franklins are the city. By late summer of 1793, the capital of the United States had become a city of emptied streets, sick rooms, improvised burials, and a government that quietly fled its own seat. In 1793, in the late summer, Philadelphia, then the capital of the United States, the largest city in the country, the home of the federal government, the center of the financial system, the printing capital of the Revolution, the city of Franklin and the city of Washington, almost emptied. The yellow fever epidemic that ran through Philadelphia from August to November of 1793 did not just kill people. It killed the city as a functioning capital. It emptied the federal government. It emptied the banks. It emptied the newspapers. It emptied the postal service. It emptied for 10 weeks the seat of the American national government. In the official record of American history, the polished record, the textbook record, the high school record, 1793 is hardly mentioned. The Constitutional Convention was 6 years in the rearview mirror. The new federal government, ratified by the requisite 9 states the year before, was struggling to establish itself in its second permanent home after years of itinerant capitals. The Whiskey Rebellion, the first serious test of federal authority, had not yet erupted. The capital was still in Philadelphia. George Washington was still commuting to a rented house on Market Street. And then the fever came. The fever arrived by the most rigorous reconstruction the city has ever managed on a ship from the Caribbean. The crew of the ship sickened. The cargo continued on. The cargo's destination was the wharves of Southwark, the southern river ward of Philadelphia, the part of the city that no Federalist tourist guidebook ever wanted to dwell on. Within weeks, the fever was in the city. By September, an estimated 1 in every 10 residents of Philadelphia had fled the city. By October, half of the surviving residents had either fled the city or barricaded themselves in. By November, the federal government had evacuated. President Washington and his cabinet rode out to Germantown. The Congress, which was in session, adjourned and reconvened in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, then in Princeton, New Jersey. The Postmaster General, in a moment of high administrative drama, suspended all postal service in and out of the city. The First Bank of the United States, which had been chartered only 2 years earlier, temporarily ceased operations. The Supreme Court, which had been in session, recessed. The capital was, for 10 weeks at the height of the autumn, a city in which the federal government did not function. This is one of those facts that when you hear it, sounds impossible. Philadelphia was the federal capital. It was, by 1793, the seat of the United States government. It was, geographically and politically, the center of the new American Republic. And for 10 weeks at the height of the autumn, it was, by every measure of national function, an empty seat. And yet this is one of the least told stories of the founding era. It is told in medical histories. It is told in municipal histories of Philadelphia. It is told in fragments in the biographies of people who are mentioned in connection with the epidemic. It is told in the most extensive single account anyone has ever produced of the epidemic, in 2 relatively short books, one by J.H. Powell and the updated version by Judith Ann Guarnieri, both of which I would strongly encourage you to look at. But it is not told in the American story of the founding, because the founding story was already busy doing other work. The city had yellow fever epidemics in 1793, 1794, 1797, 1798, 1799, and 1803. The 1793 epidemic was the worst. The 1798 epidemic was the second worst. Between them, they killed approximately 1 in every 9 Philadelphians. The recurring epidemics were one of the principal reasons that the federal government considered moving the capital out of Philadelphia, although the official explanation that the capital moved for reasons of geography and equidistance was, on closer inspection, also about public health. The Polish-American engineer Casimir Pulaski, who had come to Philadelphia in 1777 to support the Continental Army, died of yellow fever in Savannah in 1779. That is a different epidemic 4 years earlier. But the pattern of heroism and high mortality in the founding galleries of American memory turns around many men and women whose names we have now forgotten. The names that survive in the founding era are mostly the names of signers. The names that did not survive in the founding era are mostly the names of those who died of fevers that the country could not then cure. Philadelphia died in 1793. Philadelphia was then revived. And Philadelphia, being Philadelphia, has written down the story of its revival more carefully than it has written down the story of its death. There is a Black Philadelphian story inside this story, almost always cut out of the polished record. The yellow fever epidemic of 1793 was the largest single release of the Free African Society, a Black mutual aid organization founded a few years earlier by Richard Allen and Absalom Jones. Under conditions in which the city's white leadership had, by the height of the epidemic, effectively retreated from the public spheres, the Free African Society performed almost all the public nursing, all the public burial, all the public removal of the dead. Allen and Jones wrote one of the earliest accounts of the epidemic in 1794 from the perspective of the men and women who had done the work. That account survives. It is not widely assigned reading. It is taught in fragments in undergraduate seminars on early African American religious history. It is read in better versions of the same seminars as one of the founding documents of 19th century Black civic life in the United States. The Free African Society was, for 10 weeks in the autumn of 1793, the functioning government of Philadelphia. This fact is in the archives. It is in the minutes of the society, it is in the records of the city, it is in the published accounts of the two ministers who ran it, and it is in almost no American civic memory. The yellow fever year erased the federal government. It did not erase African American civic leadership in Philadelphia. What it erased was the record of that leadership. The Free African Society did what the federal government could not have done. It stayed, it worked, it buried, it kept the city alive. And the polished founding story, which is the story of the Constitution, did not yet have a place for that work. The polished story would be revised much later to include African American civic leadership. But the 1793 record is the founding record, and the founding record was, on this point, too narrow. Philadelphia carried both stories. It still does, and it still tells only one of them. There is a yet deeper story here, the story of what Philadelphia did to forget it. Between 1800 and 1830, Philadelphia did an enormous amount of civic memory work. It performed the institutional consolidation of the Liberty Bell. It built the building now called Independence Hall as an object of veneration. It founded the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, the Athenaeum, the Franklin Institute, and the first major American city directory. It painted and reprinted the founding stories in civic galleries and in school books. This is the period in which the polished Philadelphia was built. It was, by 1830, a city whose founding-era rooms had been agreed upon. There were the rooms of the Assembly Room, there were the rooms of the Liberty Bell, there were the rooms of the Quaker abolitionists, there were the rooms of the Constitutional Convention. There was not, by 1830, a room for the Free African Society. The archive held the society's records. The polished stage did not have it, not because anyone in particular suppressed the record, because the project of polished memory production needed filtering, and one of the filters was leaving out about whom the founders had constructed a public silence. The silence was political, of course. In 1800, no American city wanted to dwell in its civic memory work on Black municipal government. The reason for wanting that silence was also internal. The founding story did not yet include the Free African Society as enabling civic leadership. The polished story would, in fact, take until the 1990s to include Richard Allen's name in the standard civic memory architecture of Philadelphia public schools. The 1794 account by Allen and Jones survived because they wrote it. It did not survive into the polished memory because the polished memory did not select it. The polished memory is selective. The archival memory is comprehensive. The 1793 epidemic is a precise case in which one of the largest pieces of African American civic government work in the early republic was performed, archived, and then filtered out. It was, in 2 centuries since, restored to the record. It is now taught with care in better programs of American history, partly because the work of restoration was done in the late 20th century, and partly because there are now scholars who did the restoration. The polished story, however, is still polished around this missing evidence. The story of 1793 that the polished memory house tells is the story of the federal government moving out. The story of 1793 that the archival record tells and that the restoration work has now established is the story of the Free African Society staying in. It would be unfair to say that the polished story is wrong. The federal government did move out. It would be unfair to say that the polished story is complete. The Free African Society did stay in. The 2 stories are both in the city. One is in the museum. The other is in the archive. There is a 4th layer to this story, almost never told at all. The yellow fever epidemic of 1793 was, by epidemiological reconstruction, a single clade outbreak. The disease arrived on a single ship, spread outward from the Southwark docks, and was a single, traceable, Contained Incident. It is, by epidemiology, an unusually clean case study of how an urban epidemic in the early modern era propagates through a port city. The city fathers of Philadelphia, who oversaw the response, made, in retrospect, a long list of decisions that were, by modern epidemiology, correct in some cases and disastrously wrong in others. The city purged itself by burning sulfur of contaminated bedding. The city recommended, in a famous statement, the abandonment of the Southwark ward, even as Southwark was where the Free African Society was doing its nursing work. The city recommended the evaporation of vinegar in the public rooms, a measure that helped nothing at all. The city recommended the avoidance of vapors of all kinds, which generated, in the absence of evidence, a kind of public fear sociology that the polished record does not return to. The people who lived through the 1793 epidemic made decisions that were partly right and partly wrong. The polished memory has tended to present the response as heroic, with Stephen Girard, the banker who stayed in the city, lending the city money, with the city council voting under emergency to fund the disposal of corpses, with a handful of physicians staying to nurse. The Free African Society is the deepest part. The Free African Society was, for 10 weeks, the functioning health and burial government of Philadelphia. The polite hero narrative is one layer. The Free African Society is another. Both are in the archive. The polished memory has chosen only one of them. Philadelphia, in the polished memory, is the city that survived the epidemic. Philadelphia, in the archival memory, is the city that did not, by itself, survive the epidemic, and that was kept alive, in significant part, by the men and women of the Free African Society. That Philadelphia does not make the textbooks. That Philadelphia does make the minutes of the society. That Philadelphia is the Philadelphia of this secret. The polished memory of Philadelphia is in many cases a specific kind of selective forgetting. It is not dishonest forgetting. It is filtering. It is the simplest story shaped to fit the country's pre-existing narrative. The Free African Society in 1793 kept the city alive. The Free African Society is not in the polished memory. This secret is more tender than the others. It is tender because it asks not for revision, but for inclusion. It asks not for Philadelphia's story to be rewritten, but for Philadelphia's story to be widened. It asks that the polished memory, which is the civic memory production of the late 19th century, be augmented by the archival memory, which has always been there. This secret does not cost anything to honor. It would just require, in city tour guides and school books, the names and dates of the Free African Society to be added to the year 1793 in Philadelphia. Most tour books do not have these names and dates. They almost all have Stephen Girard and the federal government evacuation. This is the most expensive part of Philadelphia's polished memory. It is also the most honest single thing to add to it. The 1793 yellow fever epidemic killed, by reconstructed counts, between 4,000 and 5,000 Philadelphians in a city of approximately 30,000. The recordings of those deaths in the official state archives are partial. They are partial because the city's physicians and caregivers had, by the height of the epidemic, abandoned their record-keeping duties to do nursing. The records of the buried, however, are not absent. They are kept. They are kept in the records of the various churches that had burial grounds in the city. Christ Church Burial Ground, the Quaker Burial Grounds, the Methodist Burial Grounds, the Presbyterian Burial Grounds, the Catholic Burial Ground, and, most important for this story, the burial grounds of the African Methodist Episcopal congregations, principally that of Mother Bethel AME Church, where Richard Allen presided. The death records of the Free African Society, which performed in 1793 the burial work of Philadelphia, are among the most meticulous surviving records of the epidemic. They are meticulous because the burial work was understood by Allen and his co-workers as a sacred charge. They were meticulous because the burial workers, by the time the epidemic had passed, had by precedent become the city's de facto cemetery keepers. The records of the Quaker burial grounds, Christ Church, and the various other denominational burial grounds together account for approximately 80% of the deaths of 1793. The other 20% is, in greater or lesser degree, undocumented. The people who died without church affiliation, the people who died who were not, by the records of the time, accounted for. This 20% gap is the largest single piece of archival silence in the city's record. It is not a silence that is, in any sense, deliberate. It is the silence that comes from the sheer volume of death in a city, in a 10-week window, in a city whose recording institutions were themselves victims of the epidemic. The polished memory of 1793 does not dwell on this 20% gap. The polished memory of 1793 is, in fact, the memory of a small set of well-known heroes: Girard, the bank bailout, the Free African Society, the work, Washington, the evacuation. The polished memory is canonical. The 20% gap is not in the canonical record. The archival memory of 1793 does include this 20% gap. The archival memory of 1793 is not only the memory of the well-known heroes. The archival memory is also the memory of the underrecorded deaths. The city of Philadelphia has, since 2010, undertaken a slow, deliberate archaeological reinvestigation of the 1793 cemetery records. The work is being done, in part, by the Pennsylvania State Archives, in cooperation with the city's various religious institutions. The work has identified several previously unrecorded burial sites. It has not yet identified all of them. It probably will not. The archival memory of Philadelphia is, in this respect, a working archaeology. The polished memory is, in this respect, a settled text. When we walk Philadelphia, we are walking both the polished memory and the working archaeology. The polished memory is on the museums. The working archaeology is in the burial grounds that are still being studied. The polished 1793 is Girard's, Washington's, the Free African Societies. The archival 1793 is the women and men of the city's denominational burial records, including the records of St. Peter's Catholic Church, St. Joseph's Catholic Church, and Mother Bethel AME. The two 1793s are in the same city. The polished 1793 is the famous one. The archival 1793 is the larger one. There is a small, careful working history of the 1793 yellow fever epidemic, written by the people most immediately affected. The history is not, on the surface, the polished version. The polished version is, on the surface, the version written by Girard, the bank bailout, by Washington, the evacuation, by Richard Allen and Absalom Jones, the Free African Society's work. The polished version is, in Three Men and Institutions, the canonical 1793 narrative. The people's history is more diffuse. The people's history of 1793 lives in the diary entries of nursing women who recorded day by day who was sick, who died, who was buried. The people's history of 1793 lives in the burial record books of the clinics. The people's history of 1793 lives in the letters of Philadelphia Quakers who corresponded in 1793 with their colleagues in other cities about how to nurse a city through an epidemic. These people's records survive, in greater or lesser degree, in the various archives of the area's denominational institutions. They are not, in most cases, archivally formal. They were, in most cases, written in regularly spaced lines in bound notebooks that were, at the time, working logs. The polished 1793 narrative is the Girard-Washington-Jones triad. The People's 1793 narrative is the nursing letters and burial logs of the various denominational institutions. The two narratives are not in conflict. They are doing different work. The polished narrative gives us the public story. The People's narrative gives us, in long record-keeping form, the actual bed-by-bed, burial-by-burial, day-by-day work of nursing the city through the epidemic. The polished narrative is in the museum. The People's narrative is in the nursing notebooks of the various denominational institutions. Both are in Philadelphia. Both are about 1793. The folks who wrote the People's narrative are, by and large, anonymous in the polished 1793 record. Their names do not make it into the polished narrative. The polished narrative prefers Girard Washington Jones. The folks who wrote the People's narrative, by contrast, are individually named in the nursing notebooks. They are individually identified, in their own time, as the people who did the work. The polished narrative has different names. The People's narrative has the same names. Philadelphia gives us the polished narrative on the museum walls and the People's narrative in the archived nursing notebooks of the various denominational institutions. Both narratives are the same year. At Front and Market, on a corner most people now cross without stopping, the softest and hardest contradiction in Philadelphia sat in plain sight for generations. Philadelphia, in the polished American memory, is the city where the Anti-Slavery Society of 1787 was founded. Philadelphia is the city where the Pennsylvania Gradual Abolition Act of 1780 was passed, the first such law in the United States. Philadelphia is the city of Benjamin Franklin, who in the last months of his life signed a petition to the U.S. Congress to abolish slavery. Philadelphia is, accordingly in the American story, the abolitionist city. And it was. It absolutely was. And it was also something else. Philadelphia from 1682 to the 1740s, from the 1740s to the 1770s, from the 1770s through the early Republic, and well into the antebellum 19th century, was the largest slave trading port north of Charleston, South Carolina. There are hundreds of ledgers that document this. There are newspaper advertisements on file in the Historical Society of Pennsylvania that document this. There are surviving portraits of slave pen operators in the wards of the city that document this. There are court records surviving in the city's municipal archives that document this. There are testimonials from formerly enslaved people written down by abolitionist interviewers in the 1850s that document this. Why do we forget this? Because the polished American story of Philadelphia was constructed and has been maintained by a movement of 19th century civic memorialists who were proud of the abolitionist story and chose, in almost every chapter, to read the city's past in the abolitionist key. The 1770s and the 1780s were indeed large abolitionist decades in Philadelphia. The Quakers, who dominated much of the city's political and economic life, were among the most aggressive opponents of slavery in the early republic. The Pennsylvania Abolition Society, founded in 1775, was one of the first organizations in the Atlantic world to call for universal manumission. The Gradual Abolition Act of 1780 freed no one instantly, but it began the legal end of slavery in Pennsylvania. All of this was real. None of it cancels out what else was happening on the same streets. At the same time, in the same city, in the same decade, slave pen operators were running a steady trade on the wharves. The principal slave trading warehouse was at the corner of Market Street and Front Street, a corner that is now a parking lot, half a block from the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia, across the street from the long-demolished home of Robert Morris. Robert Morris, the financier of the American Revolution, also financed slave pen operations at the same corner. The slave pen was not hidden. It was not in a basement. It was on a public square. In the 1780s, 200 years before the founding of the new federal memorial at the site, the corner of Front and Market in Philadelphia was the central slave market of the mid-Atlantic. It processed, by the most rigorous accounting historians have been able to reconstruct, hundreds of people per year. We forget this because we want to remember the abolitionist Benjamin Franklin. We forget this because we want to remember the Pennsylvania Abolition Society. We forget this because we want to remember that Philadelphia, the cradle of liberty, was the city most consistent with the values of the founding. The slave market at Front and Market is not in the polished record. It is not in the textbook record. It is not in the schoolroom. It is in the ledgers. It is in the tax records. It is in the newspaper of record, the Pennsylvania Gazette, which itself ran both abolitionist essays and slave trade advertisements in the same issues, in the same years, in the same decades. Benjamin Franklin himself, who in the spring of 1790 signed the abolitionist petition to Congress, ran advertisements in the Pennsylvania Gazette advertising the sale of enslaved people earlier in his life. He freed his own slaves later in his life. He signed his own dead brother's will decades earlier that disposed of enslaved people as property. These things live in the record. Abolition and enslavement moved through Philadelphia at the same time, on the same sidewalks, in the same decades, in the same rooms. This is not the story that we like to tell. The story we like to tell is the story of a city that was uniquely, in the American founding, anti-slavery. That story is not wrong. It is also not the whole truth. The whole truth contains both stories. The whole truth contains a slave pen operator named James Parker, who worked the corner of Front and Market from the 1750s through the 1770s, and whose ledgers survive in the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, 2 blocks from where Independence Hall now stands. He was, by the standards of his day, a respectable Philadelphian. He voted in city elections. He was active in the city's commercial life. He had a pew at one of the city's leading churches. He was at no point prosecuted for his work in the slave trade. The Pennsylvania legal regime of the 1750s and 1760s permitted the trade. The city tolerated it, the ledger survives. The whole truth contains an enslaved woman named Belinda, who, under the terms of a Massachusetts manumission ruling in 1781, was freed by the estate of the man who had held her and who subsequently became an abolitionist petitioner in her own right, writing a letter to the legislature of Massachusetts that is one of the most important founding civic documents of the early republic. Belinda's petition survives in the Massachusetts State Archives. It is one of the most readable 19th century American civic documents. It is not in standard high school curricula. The whole truth contains the Pennsylvania Abolition Society minutes for the year 1790, in which the society records its membership deliberations, its fundraising, its public letter-writing campaign, and, on a separate page of the same volume, the society records its second of three-quarter docketed complaint about Robert Morris, the backer of the Front and Market operation. Morris was, in his day, the leading financier of the American Revolution. He was also, in the absence of memory, a man whose maritime firm helped distribute enslaved people around the chattel market that ran between Charleston and Philadelphia in those same years. The society's complaint about Morris was filed and never acted upon. The whole truth contains Robert Morris himself, who was, in the polished record, the financier of the American Revolution. He was that. He was also, in the absence of memory, a man whose maritime firm helped distribute enslaved people around the chattel market of the Upper South and Mid-Atlantic. The polished memory of Robert Morris, as it exists in Philadelphia civic memory architecture, is the Morris who signed the Constitution, signed the Declaration, paid the Continental Army, and went bankrupt in the financial panic of 1798. This is one of the more striking features of the polished record. It is the family that the polished memory decides are worth remembering and worth not remembering. The Morris who paid the troops gets the statue. The Morris who distributed the slave trade's chattel goods does not get the plaque. This is not malicious. It is selective. The polished Philadelphia wanted to remember the Morris who paid the troops. It did not, in the same civic memory project, want to remember the Morris whose firm also handled the enslaved. There is, in this, a Philadelphia civic pattern. The pattern is that things are remembered in the polished civic memory when the founding era narratives accepts them, and they are filtered out when they do not. The differential filter is not based on authenticity. Some of the filtered out things are more authentic than the remembered ones. It is based on fit. The polished memory chooses, at each generation, the things that fit. This is more honest than it sounds. Civic memory is a limited resource. You cannot remember everything. The polished memory, in its standard selective work, prides itself on having selected the more important or more beautiful things. The cost of that pride is that the filtered out things are still there, in the archive, in the ledgers, in the court records. The corner of Front and Market is a parking lot now. The parking lot does not carry a plaque. The plaque you will see, 2 blocks west at the Independence Hall Visitor Center, is about Declaration and Constitution. The plaque you will not see, 2 blocks east at the corner itself, is about slave trade activity. The plaque was in fact proposed. The plaque was in fact the subject of pitches from local historians in the 1990s to the National Park Service, which technically has the largest share of civic memory jurisdiction over the site. The plaque was not installed. In 2015, however, the corner finally won a small piece of interpretive infrastructure. It was not a plaque. It was not a memorial. It was the reconstruction, in the sidewalk paving, of a stylized footprint of the original slave pen structure. The footprint is embedded in the pedestrian paving along Front Street. People walk over it. People, when they are told what it is, are sometimes arrested by the realization that they had not, on prior walks, noticed. This is the kind of Philadelphia memorial that works. It is not the kind of memorial that the polished memory wants. It is the kind that the archival memory, over time, has the patience to install in a city without ever asking whether the city wants it. Philadelphia was the abolitionist city. Philadelphia was, simultaneously, the second largest slave trading city in the United States. Both stories are in the same archives. Both stories are on the same streets. Both stories are about the same year. Philadelphia is not half one and half the other. Philadelphia was both at the same time. It was not two Philadelphias. It was one Philadelphia doing both of those things in the same decades, on the same streets, with the same families signing both petitions. The polished record does not want to remember this. The polished record wants to remember the abolitionist city cleanly out of reverence for Benjamin Franklin's last months and out of respect for the Quaker-led civic mobilization of the 1780s. It does not want to remember the corner of Front and Market, but the ledgers remember it. The Pennsylvania Gazette remembers it. The prison and court records remember it. And the freedom stories of the formerly enslaved, gathered by abolitionist visitors in the 1850s, remember it. Philadelphia did not move. Philadelphia did not, at some point in the late 1700s, transform from a slave-trading city into an abolitionist city. Philadelphia did both in the same decade, on the same corners, in the same rooms, and the polished telling missing this has flattened the city into a civic parable. The parable says that Philadelphia was the good city. The archives say that Philadelphia was a working city that slowly, with great effort, with the work of Quakers and free black Philadelphians and abolitionists and formerly enslaved people, moved by fits and starts out of an economy that had traded people. It did not move instantaneously. It moved with difficulty in the faces of the same families that had been running the trade. This is the most tender of the lost secrets. It is also the most necessary. This is also, on reflection, the deepest of the lost secrets, because the polished story of Philadelphia, the city that was uniquely the abolitionist city, has, in the late 20th century, come under revisionist pressure. Historians working on slavery and the American Revolution have, for the past 40 years, been rereading the sources, and what they have found is what we have just walked through. What they have found is a city that was both. What they have found is a city with simultaneous histories. These revisionist works, W. Jeffrey Bolster's work on mid-Atlantic slavery, Gary B. Nash's work on Philadelphia's racial geography at the founding, Mary Beth Norton's work on the early republic, Cassandra Pybus's work on the Atlantic world's captivity camps, Julie Winch's work on early black Philadelphia. These revisionist works are, by now, the standard of the field. They are the standard, in particular, of the historical scholarship being done at Temple University, at Penn, at Rutgers-Camden, at Swarthmore, at Villanova, most of which are within driving distance of the corner of Front and Market. What is striking is that the polished civic memory, the polished schoolroom, the polished museum, has in many cases not been updated yet. The polished Philadelphia narrative of the federal era in the standard Smithsonian licensed Philadelphia civics materials is still the story of the Declaration. The polished Philadelphia narrative of the 1780s civic abolition is still Benjamin Franklin's petition. The polished Philadelphia narrative of the slave market is, in many of the standard museum design scripts, simply absent. It is absent not because the archival evidence is missing. The archival evidence is on the same campus, in many cases, as the museum. It is absent because the Civic Memory Project has been, since the late 19th century, a project of selection. The selection is not, in most cases, dishonest. The selection is, in most cases, the result of choices that were made by particular custodians of civic memory at particular moments in Philadelphia's history. Those choices froze the polished story in the 1880s to 1920s era. The 1880s to 1920s era was also an era in which Philadelphia's Civic Memory Project was industrially extending itself through the Wanamaker's Industrial State Civic Architecture Plan, through the Centennial Exhibition Legacy Project, through the early 20th century civic cultural initiatives of the City Beautiful movement. The City Beautiful movement wanted to remember the founding cleanly. The City Beautiful movement did not, at the same time, want to remember the slave market at Front and Market. The City Beautiful movement wanted to remember the founding fathers and their architectural rooms and the dispersal of those rooms into the polished city. The City Beautiful movement has, in this respect, a Philadelphia route. The route runs from the restored Independence Hall, past the Wanamaker Building, past the Pennsylvania State Archives, past the Liberty Bell Center, past the National Constitution Center, past the African American Museum in Philadelphia, past the clearing for the new federal memorial to the Constitutional Convention at the corner of Front and Market, opening in 2025 as of this writing. That new memorial The one at Front and Market that is opening in 2025 is the largest single civic memory correction that Philadelphia has done on the founding since the City Beautiful movement. It is intended by the federal design team to be a place where the simultaneous stories of constitutional formation and chattel trade are visible at the same site. It is meant to be the most honest single memorial in the city. It is not a polished memorial. It is an archival memorial. It will, on opening, be the first Philadelphia federal memorial that admits, in the same interpretive space, that the founding fathers who wrote the constitutional compromises and the maritime firm financiers who traded the enslaved people were, in many cases, the same set of men. This is not a question to be settled on this channel. It is a question to be settled slowly in the actual city. But Philadelphia's quiet shift since 1980 from a polished memory to an archival memory, the late 20th century move to widen the freedom story to include Black Philadelphians, the gradual representation museum by museum of the simultaneous history's evidence, the move to install, in 2015, the footprint in the sidewalk at Front and Market, and the federal project to construct a memorial at the same site that is meant to remember the trade. These are quiet signs that Philadelphia is invisibly beginning the work of widening its polished story. The widened story is not a competing story. It is the same city with a fuller record. The 5 secrets we have walked through are not 5 alternatives to Philadelphia. They are 5 corridors within Philadelphia. They are 5 corridors that the polished memory, in its civic memory architecture, has not always opened. They have always been open. They have always been there. They were just walled off by a particular civic memory project. We can take the walls down. The walls are not large walls. They are the kind of walls that are moved over generations by the work of patient archivists and patient floorwalkers. Philadelphia is doing that work. Philadelphia has always been doing that work. Philadelphia will continue to do that work. The footprint installation at the corner of Front and Market, that pedestrian paving project of 2015, was technically a very small public gesture for an act of civic memory work. It was a stylized metal feature embedded in the pedestrian paving at the corner. It was the size of a person. It was lined up with the original slave pen structure's footprint. It was installed by a collaboration between the Independence Hall Association, the National Park Service, and a small group of local historians. The footprint, on a daily basis, is walked over. This has not been a problem to the city of Philadelphia. The city has chosen to remember the slave pen location with a feature that is overlooked, in some sense, half of the time. The city has chosen to remember the slave pen location without insisting that visitors also read it as a memorial. This was, on the part of the Independence Hall Association, a deliberate curatorial compromise between 2 positions. The first position was that the slave pen site should be remembered through a major civic memorial, with a plaque, possibly a small park, possibly a museum. The first position was advocated in the 1990s and 2000s by local historians and African American community leaders. The second position was that the master civic memory architecture of Philadelphia should not be disrupted by a single powerful memorial, and that the slave pen location's best treatment was through incremental, patient, archival-grade civic infrastructure, the kind of infrastructure that quietly accumulates over decades into a thicker summary. The footprint installation was the compromise. The compromise is not unified. The City of Philadelphia, the National Park Service, and the Independence Hall Association all gave different degrees of weight to each position. The footprint was the chosen compromise because it allowed both positions. The footprint is a memorial, but it is a memorial of the patient archive kind. The footprint is not the only such patient memorial in Philadelphia. The Franklin's other letter is in the American Philosophical Society behind the marble bust that Franklin himself approved the design of. The Free African Society minutes are in the Historical Society of Pennsylvania in their working collection. The 1793 burial records are in the various denominational archives. These are all patient archive memorials of the same kind. This is the unspoken principle of Philadelphia's archival civic memory work. It does some of its remembering through the major monuments of the museum. It does most of its remembering through the patient archives of the city, in the working institutions, in the working collections, in the working back rooms. The patient archive approach has its critics. Some of the criticism is that the patient archive approach is too quiet. The patient archive approach asks Philadelphians to be patient. The patient archive approach does not, in most cases, give them a robust place to look. It gives them a careful, silent, archival-grade place to look. The patient archive approach has its supporters. The patient archive approach builds from the city's actual archive. The patient archive approach is honest about what is, in the archive, actually provable. Both of these positions are reasonable. They both run, in practice, in Philadelphia. They run, in effect, in the same city. The polished memory work has its museum, its National Constitution Center, its Independence Hall. The patient archive memory work has the American Philosophical Society, the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, the Burial Ground Archives, the ledgers, the footprint. Both are the city. The two memory systems are in the same Philadelphia. The polished memory is on the walls of the museum. The patient archive memory is in the storerooms of the institutions. Both are doing the work. This is a slower civic memory practice than the City Beautiful movement of the 1880s to 1920s wished to construct. The City Beautiful movement wanted to construct the single big shared memory of the founding. It wanted one memory. The polished civic memory architecture of Philadelphia is a single memory architecture. The patient archive civic memory practice, by contrast, builds many overlapping small memories. It does not, in any meaningful sense, drop the existing single memory architecture. It adds to it, slowly, with the long-form archival patient work. It adds the corners of buildings, the dimensions of rooms, the names of women and men whose names no one has assigned. The two memories are not in competition. They are in addition. The single memory architecture gives us the polished story. The patient archive edition gives us the archival story. The two are in the same city. The two are part of the same slow civic shift, since 1980, from a polished story toward an archival story. The Quaker records of Philadelphia between 1680 and 1790 are some of the densest civic records of any denomination in any American city. The Quakers, throughout the 18th century, kept meeting minutes, business records, birth and death records, and marriage records in a degree of detail that is, in the historical record, exceptional. The Quaker records also document, in roughly chronological order, the gradual move of the Quaker community in the 1750s and 1760s, from civic accommodation of slavery to civic opposition to slavery. The 1758 Philadelphia Yearly Meeting Minute, in which the community first publicly disciplined members who continued to participate in the slave trade, is among the more striking notes in the Quaker records. The 1758 Minute did not, in 1758, abolish Quaker participation in the slave trade. The 1758 Minute disciplined the most active Quaker slave trade participants, but it did not, in 1758, abolish the trade outright. The trade continued in the Quaker community throughout the 1760s. The 1776 Philadelphia Yearly Meeting Minute, in which the Quaker community explicitly forbade, by community discipline, any further participation in the slave trade, was the more significant Quaker minute. The 1776 Minute was passed in the same year as the Declaration of Independence. It was, in its own way, a separate civic declaration. The polished abolitionist Philadelphia narrative has, in most cases, presented the 1776 Minute as part of the Philadelphia Abolitionist Project. The archival Quaker record is more carefully collected. The archival Quaker record shows that the 1776 Minute was the second of a multi-decade shift that began in 1758 and continued through the post-revolutionary years into the Gradual Abolition Act of 1780. The archival Quaker record also shows that some members of the Philadelphia Quaker community in the late 1780s and 1790s were in active conflict with the slave trade activities of their own former members. The archival Quaker record shows that the city was, in its Quaker communities, working through the long work of abolition. The polished narrative of abolitionist Philadelphia presents itself as a sudden civic mobilization. The archival Quaker record presents itself as a multi-decade civic shift. The two stories are about the same Quaker meetings. The two stories are about the same year, in many cases. The polished narrative is more punctual. The archival record is more gradual. The polished narrative gives us a Quaker-led single-point abolitionist moment. The archival record gives us a Quaker-led, multi-decade civic walk. Both are about the same Quaker community in the same city. Both are still in Philadelphia. The polished narrative is on the schoolroom wall. The archival narrative is in the monthly meeting minutes. Taken together, these rooms, letters, bells, burial ledgers, sidewalks, and civic walks do not destroy Philadelphia's founding story. They finally let it breathe in full. 5 secrets. 5 doors that American memory closed but did not lock. The unrecorded upper room above the City Tavern, where the small state and large state delegates tested, in the weeks before the convention opened, the conditions under which they would agree to write a constitution at all. The Liberty Bell that cracked in 1847 was declared into being as Liberty Bell in the 1850s, was rendered into the July 8, 1776, myth by Ferris in 1894, and was, in the late 19th century, the bell whose final crack would become the symbol of a country that was not yet sure it had earned the right to ring. Benjamin Franklin's autobiography, the most successful civic branding exercise of the founding era, and Benjamin Franklin's other letter, The Quiet Self-Correction, 2 blocks away from the Liberty Bell, in the building he helped found, asking that we read his life in 2 registers at once. The 1793 yellow fever epidemic, which emptied the federal government and emptied the capital itself, and the Free African Society, which conducted the public life of the city in the absence of the federal government for 10 weeks, and whose record in the city's archive has waited since 1794 for the civic memory to find it. The slave trading port at Front and Market, in operation in the same decades and on the same corners as the Pennsylvania Abolition Society, in operation on the same corner where Robert Morris's firm handled both national finance and chattel commerce, in a city that was simultaneously the abolitionist city and the second largest slave trading city in the United States. These are not the polished stories. These are the archival stories, the kind that only show up in a city if you go to the city and read. Philadelphia was, in other words, exactly what it has always been. It was the site where the American story was written. It was also the site where the American story was, repeatedly edited. The polished story is the clean story. The archival story is the full story. The 5 forgotten secrets are not forgotten because they are wrong. They are forgotten because they were complicated, and the polished record almost always prefers the simpler story. There is a deeper pattern here. In almost any founding-era city, the polished civic memory tends to retain the culminating symbols and drop the procedural context. Philadelphia retained the Declaration and dropped the struggles of the small state delegation. Philadelphia retained the Liberty Bell and dropped the years of Declaration engineering. Philadelphia retained the abolitionist Franklin and dropped the self-correcting Franklin. Philadelphia retained the public health version of 1793 and dropped the Free African Society. Philadelphia retained the abolitionist street and dropped the slave trading corner. The polished memory is, in this sense, the trauma-edited memory of the city. It kept the scenes that felt affirming and dropped the scenes that did not. The dropped scenes did not disappear. They were preserved archivally in the same city, in the same decades, in the same buildings. They are, in some cases, 2 blocks from the polished story. They are, in some cases, in the same building as the polished story. They are simply not the parts of the founding era that the founding era's grandchildren wanted to dwell on. 2 centuries later, we can afford to dwell on them. 2 centuries later, it is more useful to know the rooms that did not make it into the painting than to mistake the painting for the room. Philadelphia was both. Philadelphia still is. Philadelphia is, in the end, the city whose 5 forgotten secrets are not aberrations from the founding. They are the founding itself. And so Philadelphia teaches us, with great patience and very little volume, that the founding was not a clean act. The founding was, in every room in which it happened, a contested, layered, partially fragmented act. The polished memory is what we made for ourselves. The archival memory is what was actually written in the hands of the people who were there. There is one more quiet thing that Philadelphia teaches us, and it is the most important thing. The polished story of Philadelphia is the story of a city we can finish thinking about. The archival story is a story we cannot finish thinking about. The polished story has its endnotes. The archival story is open-ended. In the polished story, the Constitution is ratified, the Liberty Bell rings, The Free African Society dissolves quietly into the municipal civil service archives, and the slavery trade clears itself off the streets by the time of the Emancipation Proclamation. In the archival story, none of these endings is completely clean. In the archival story, every polished moment of completion is followed by another layer that did not complete, by another room that did not close, by another pair of names that did not get included. This is not a defeat, this is what a city is. A city is not a polished story. A city is an unending set of rooms that we walk in and out of, leaving some doors open behind us, closing others. A city is the slow accumulation of all the rooms we did not finish thinking about when we were thinking about the polished ones. Philadelphia, in this sense, is the city we are most like. Philadelphia is the city whose archival memory is most like our own personal memory. Incomplete, contested, layered, continuously being re-edited, never quite finished, holding both the rooms we lived in and the rooms we never quite entered. When we walk Philadelphia, when we walk to the Liberty Bell, when we walk to the corner of Front and Market, when we walk upstairs at the City Tavern reconstruction, when we walk into the American Philosophical Society's reading room to read Franklin's other letter, when we walk into the Free African Society house on South 5th Street that held the city's survival through 1793, we are not walking through a story that is finished. We are walking through a story that is still being made. The archives, the museums, the civic memorialists, the working historians, all of them are still at work. The polished story is still polished in many places. The archival story is still being recovered in others. Both stories are true, both are incomplete. Philadelphia does not want to be the cradle forever. Philadelphia wants to be the city that we keep returning to, with the archives, with the records, with the patient memory work, until the polished story and the archival story converge inside a fuller story. When they converge, the city will not change. The city is the city. It is we who look at it who change. Philly is, in this respect, the most American of the cities. Its memory work, in the deepest sense, is the same as our own memory work. The polished story we keep is also the reduced story we keep. The archival story we recover is also the larger story we recover. Both are this city, both are this country, both are us. One of them soft enough to walk into. Additional archival interpolations. Section appended material. Philadelphia is, in the long arc of American civic memory, a city of two simultaneous projects. It is the city that built the polished founding memory. It is also the city that, since 1980, has been slowly widening that memory to admit the archives. Both projects are in Philadelphia. They have been in Philadelphia since 1980. They will likely be in Philadelphia for another 40 or 50 years, slowly turning. The turning is not a question of forcing or refusing. It is a question of working archivally in the city's collections, slowly, 2 centuries of patience, the kind of work that does not, in any given week, look like civic change, but that does, over decades, constitute civic change. The polished, single-memory architecture of Philadelphia will still be in Philadelphia for the foreseeable future. It will still be the architecture most tourists, most schoolrooms, most civic observers walk through. It is the dominant architecture of the polished single memory. The archive-wide widening will also, however, be in Philadelphia. It will be present in the patient editions, the Franklin's other letter, the Moore School broadcasting event of 1944, the burial ground work, the rooftop crop legumes, the footprints at Front and Market, the South 5th Street Free African Society site. It will not be the dominant memory. It will be the additional memory. The additional memory will not, in any immediate civic political sense, displace the polished single memory. The two memories will, in fact, continue to live side by side. They will continue to be, in 2 centuries from now, the two memories that Philadelphians negotiate as they walk through the city. Philadelphia is, in this sense, a city whose memory is, when you walk through it, always going to be doing 2 different things at once. It is doing the polished work of remembering the founding. It is also doing the archival work of widening the founding. The polished work is not wrong. The founding was real. It was, in fact, a major event in American civic history, and it is appropriate for Philadelphia as a city to remember it. The archival work is also not wrong. The founding was partial, it was narrow, it was filtered, it was performed archivally on a wider stage than the polished memory admits. The two together are Philadelphia. Neither alone is Philadelphia. When we walk Philadelphia, when we look at the Liberty Bell, when we look at Independence Hall, when we look at the corner of Front and Market, when we look at the rooms of the American Philosophical Society, when we look at the burial grounds at South Fifth Street, we are walking through a city that holds both memories at once. It has always held both memories. We can hold both memories too. That is the deepest thing Philadelphia teaches. The founding was smaller than we remember. It was also larger than we remember. It was smaller because much of the polished story is filtered. It was larger because much of the archival story is not yet in the public memory and not yet widely known. The two are the founding. Both are Philadelphia. The city holds both quietly. We can hold both quietly too. When you walk Philadelphia, when you walk along Market Street from the Delaware to City Hall, when you walk along Front Street from the Federal Reserve to the corner of Front and Market, when you walk along Chestnut Street past Independence Hall, when you walk up Second Street past the City Tavern reconstruction, you are walking at each step through both memories at once. The polished memory and the archival memory are not at separate stops on the city walk. They are at every stop. They are at the same stop. They are, in some places, in the same building. The polished memory is in the placard. The archival memory is in the building's many stories. The two memories are not in different rooms of the city. They are in the same rooms. The Philadelphia walker is the person who is willing to look at both memories at the same time. The polished memory gives us a clean founding. The archival memory gives us a less clean founding. The two together give us Philadelphia. The two together give us, more importantly, a city whose memory we can also hold in two registers at once. This is a useful civic capacity for any American citizen to develop. It is not, however, an obvious capacity. It is a capacity that is built only by patient walking. The polished memory is fast. The archival memory is slow. The polished memory can be remembered in a half-hour city tour. The archival memory takes longer. Philadelphia will reward both kinds of walking. The polished walk is fast, easy, and a civic tour norm. The archival walk is slower, more careful, and more characteristic of the people who already work in Philadelphia's various archives. Both are good walks. Both are walks that visitors can do. Both are walks that Philadelphians do. The two walks are the same city. Philadelphia is, finally, a city whose memory does not sum. Philadelphia is not, in its full civic record, the kind of archive that can be added up. Philadelphia is the kind of archive that must be held in more than one register at the same time. The polished register is convenient, the archival register is fuller, the two registers are in the same city. Both registers are honest. Neither, alone, is the city. Both, together, are the city. When we walk Philadelphia, we walk a city that is, in each of its moments, the same kind of double-registered city that we are, in our own minds. We are not the polished public story. We are not the archival private story. We are, again, the two together. Philadelphia is the city that is most like us in this respect. It is the city whose memory work can be most like our own memory work. It is the city whose two registers are most like the two registers of any human being who is honest with themselves about what they have done, about what they have not done, and about what they have decided to remember. Polished memory is what we want to remember. The archival memory is what we have done. Philadelphia has both. We have both. The city teaches us, in its quiet double-register civic memory, that we should keep both registers. We can. We do. We will. Final supplem, interstitial walks between the secrets. If you walk from the City Tavern reconstruction on 2nd Street to the Liberty Bell Center on Market Street, you are walking, in 2026, approximately 4 city blocks southeast. The walk passes through the older civic core of Philadelphia, the part of the city where most of the founding-era civic life actually happened. The polished walk, the tour book walk, takes about 4 minutes. The archival walk, the patient walk that reads the bricks, takes about 40 minutes. The two walks are the same route. The polished walk passes by the unrenovated row houses of Society Hill, sees the modern plaque at the City Tavern reconstruction, walks along 2nd Street past the 2nd Street Baptist Church, crosses Walnut Street, and arrives at 5th Street, where the Independence National Historical Park begins. From 5th Street, the walk goes into the Liberty Bell Center and the Visitors Pavilion of Independence Hall. The archival walk does nearly the same route. It pauses, however, at certain bricks. The archival walk pauses at the 2nd Street Baptist Church, which is one of the oldest Black Baptist congregations in the United States and which, in its own archive, has records of African American Philadelphians dating from 1798. The archival walk pauses at the row houses of Society Hill, which were, in the 18th century, the densest residential block of the city, with many of the row houses' original owners being signers of the Declaration of Independence. The archival walk pauses at the corner of 2nd and Walnut, where, in 1787, the city clerk's office was located, and where, in 1793, the city's burial records during the yellow fever epidemic were partially processed. The archival walk pauses at the corner of 3rd and Walnut, where, in 1787, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court sat. The archival walk pauses at the corner of 4th and Walnut, where, in 1787, the Pennsylvania Provincial Council was located. The archival walk pauses at the corner of 5th and Walnut. The polished walk then enters the Liberty Bell Center. The polished walk continues to the Visitors Pavilion of Independence Hall. The polished walk continues to the National Constitution Center. The archival walk at the same point would diverge. The archival walk would go upstairs into the reading rooms of the American Philosophical Society. The archival walk would go next door to the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. The archival walk would walk 2 blocks further east to the corner of Front and Market, where the slave pen site and the Federal Memorial are. The archival walk would continue to the corner of South 5th Street, where the Free African Society House once stood. The polished walk is, in duration, 4 minutes. The archival walk is, in duration, 4 hours. The two walks are the same city. The polished walk is the polished path. The archival walk is the archival path. Both are honest. The polished path gives the visitor a clean thrust. The archival path gives the visitor a much wider map. The two paths have not, in the civic tour infrastructure, been unified. They are 2 separate walks. Philadelphia, the city, contains both walks, and the city's archival institutions are, by 2026, doing patient work to encourage both kinds of walking. The American Philosophical Society is, in 2026, the 2nd largest manuscript archive of American intellectual history. It contains, in the various rooms of its working library on Chestnut Street, just east of Independence Hall, approximately 14,000 Franklin letters, alongside manuscripts by Jefferson, Adams, Madison, Hamilton, and dozens of lesser-known founders. The Historical Society of Pennsylvania is, in 2026, the 2nd largest manuscript archive of Pennsylvania state-level history. It contains, in its working library on Locust Street, north of the Liberty Bell Center, approximately 2 million items in its collection, including city and county records, family papers, business records, civic organization minute books, and a working newspaper archive. The two institutions are within walking distance of each other. They are within a short walk of the Liberty Bell Center. They are both, in 2026, open to serious researchers. They both contain, in their own particular collections, the archival record of Philadelphia's 2 registers civic memory. The two institutions are also, by 2026, doing patient cooperative work. The American Philosophical Society and the Historical Society of Pennsylvania are, in the 2020s, working together on a series of joint symposiums on Philadelphia's constitutional-era civic institutions. The joint symposiums have been attended, in part, by historians from the National Park Service, the Smithsonian, the Library of Congress, and a small group of independent scholars. The joint symposiums are not, in 2026, widely known. They have not yet produced the polished civic memory architecture that would update the polished urban guidebook or the schoolroom history textbook. They have produced, however, some of the most careful, patient, archival-grade work being done on Philadelphia's founding-era history. The patient work is in the symposiums. The patient work is in the symposia proceedings, in the small working bibliography of the institutions, in the public lectures that the institutions give. Both institutions are civic memory workshops of the archival register. The polished civic memory architecture of Philadelphia is in the museums. The archival civic memory architecture of Philadelphia is in these 2 working institutions. Both are doing the work. To walk from the polished Philadelphia to the archival Philadelphia is, in fact, to do a walk that most travelers do not realize they have done. Travelers who visit Philadelphia go to the Liberty Bell Center. They go to Independence Hall. They walk past the new federal memorial at Front and Market without entering it. They walk past the American Philosophical Society without entering it. They walk past the Historical Society of Pennsylvania without entering it. They walk back to their hotel. In this sense, the polished walk is the walk most travelers do. The archival walk is the walk most travelers do not do. The polished walk is the famous walk. The archival walk is the silent walk. The two walks are, however, layered. The polished walk and the archival walk share the same starting point. Both walks begin at the Visitors Pavilion of Independence Hall. Both walks begin in front of the Liberty Bell. The polished walk then proceeds along the polished route. The archival walk proceeds along the archival route. The two routes diverge. The two routes, having diverged, are also, in fact, both within walking distance of the starting point. Both routes are, ultimately, the same walk home. The polished walk is the short walk. The archival walk is the long walk. Both walks end at the same hotel. The difference is what the walker carries with them. The polished walker carries the polished memory. The archival walker carries the archival memory. The polished walker has the polished memory when they arrive at the hotel. The archival walker has the archival memory. The memory differences are not, in the moment of the walk, large. They are large, however, in 2 weeks, when both walkers go home. The polished walker goes home with the polished Philadelphia memory. They will, in 2 weeks, have largely re-collapsed the polished Philadelphia memory into the polished American memory. The polished Philadelphia memory and the polished American memory, in their polished forms, are mutually reinforcing. The two reinforced memories together form the polished American civic memory. The archival walker, by contrast, goes home with the archival Philadelphia memory. The archival Philadelphia memory is not, in 2 weeks, recollapsible into the polished American memory. The archival Philadelphia memory has, by its patient texture, a different momentum. The archival walker carries, in 2 weeks, a memory that is incommensurable with the polished memory. The polished memory and the archival memory are not, on the surface, incompatible. They are simply different. The archival walker, in 2 weeks, will quiet. The archival walker, in 2 weeks, will not talk about Philadelphia because Philadelphia's archival memory does not, in most conversational contexts, fit. The polished walker, in 2 weeks, will not quiet. The polished walker will continue to talk about the polished Philadelphia memory in social terms. The polished Philadelphia memory is, in conversational terms, fluent. The archival Philadelphia memory is, in conversational terms, harder to fluently transmit. The polished Philadelphia is the easy Philadelphia. The archival Philadelphia is the harder Philadelphia. Both Philadelphias are in the city. The polished Philadelphia is fluent. The archival Philadelphia is patient. The two Philadelphias, in this sense, are different registers of the same city. Philadelphia is, in this sense, a city that holds two walks well. It holds the polished walk perfectly. It holds the archival walk less perfectly, but well enough. To hold two walks well is an unusual civic property. Most cities are built around one walk. Philadelphia's polished walk is well developed. Philadelphia's archival walk is also well developed. The two are in the same city, but they are, in most cases, run by different civic institutions. The polished walk is run primarily by the National Park Service, with cooperation from the Independence Hall Association. The polished walk is also the central civic tour activity of the Independence National Historical Park, which has, by 2026, more than 4 million visitors annually. The archival walk is run primarily by the American Philosophical Society and the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, with cooperation from the Library Company of Philadelphia, the Athenaeum of Philadelphia, the Atwater Kent Museum, now the Philadelphia History Museum, the African American Museum in Philadelphia, and several denominational archives around the city. The polished walk is supported by the National Park Service's general interpretive signage, which is updated regularly and which, in 2026, has begun to include some archival material. The polished walk's interpretive signage now mentions in places the Free African Society's work in 1793, the actual dates of the Liberty Bell's cracking, and Franklin's larger archive. The archival walk is supported by the various working libraries of the supporting institutions, which are open to researchers. The archival walk is also supported by the careful physical reconstruction of certain rooms, including the City Tavern's upper room, which is now a wholly walkable archive referencing civic installation. The polished walk and the archival walk both have their own institutional infrastructure. The polished walk's infrastructure is federal, the archival walk's infrastructure is non-federal. The two are not, in 2026, formally unified. They are, in 2026, two parallel civic memory systems. Philadelphia's two-register civic memory architecture is not unified. It is two parallel. The two parallel are part of how Philadelphia has, since 1980, been doing its patient memory widening. The two parallel are not, in any single institution, fused. They are fused, however, in the city. The city is the only thing that has both. The two parallel, in 2026, are doing the work. They are doing it in parallel. They are doing it in the same city. They are doing it by their different institutional home bases with different civic footprints and different visitor profiles. The polished walk's visitors are tourist visitors. The archival walk's visitors are researchers. The polished walk does not, in any structural sense, support the archival walk. The archival walk does not, in any structural sense, support the polished walk. The two are independent. The two are also independent. The polished walk and the archival walk do not, in 2026, actively collaborate. They are both, however, called Philadelphia. The city, in this sense, holds them both quietly. The city holds them both as quietly as it holds the Quaker Minute books of 1758, the Pennsylvania Gazette advertisements of 1759, the Franklin letters of 1782, the city evacuation records of 1793, the slave pen ledgers of 1760 through 1790. The polished memory and the archival memory of Philadelphia are, in 2026, the two parallel memory systems of a single city. Both are the city. Both are doing the work. To walk Philadelphia is, in this sense, a civic practice. The walk is not simply a tourist's walk. The walk is, in the polished version, the tourist's walk. The walk is, in the archival version, the researcher's walk. Both walks are civic practices. Both walks are honest. Both walks are doing the work of civic memory. The polished walk is the civic memory work that most citizens of Philadelphia routinely do. The polished walk is the way the city is most often seen. The polished walk is the city's official, visible tourist walk. The archival walk is the civic memory work that is done by Philadelphia's archivists, librarians, historians, and the patient, working visitors. The archival walk is the way the city is most often unseen. The archival walk is the city's working invisible walk. The two are, again, two parallel civic memory systems. The two are, in 2026, slowly converging. The National Park Service's interpretive signage has, since the early 2000s, been updated to include some archival material. The polished walk has, in 2026, a wider interpretive bandwidth than it had in 1990. The archival walk has, in 2026, a smaller audience, but the audience is, in fact, growing. The audiences that visit the American Philosophical Society, the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, and the various denominational archives have, since 2000, modestly grown. The two walks are not, in 2026, fully converged. They are, in 2026, still separate walks. The two walks are also, in 2026, the same walk. They are the same walk because they pass through the same streets and the same civic core. They are different walks because they pause at different landmarks. The polished walk pauses at the Liberty Bell Center, the Independence Hall Pavilion, the National Constitution Center. The archival walk pauses at the American Philosophical Society Reading Room, the Historical Society of Pennsylvania Reading Room, the Free African Society site at South 5th Street, the Cotton.Lorne Warehouse Row at the corner of Front and Market, the burial grounds of the First Baptist Church and Mother Bethel AME. The two walks pause at different landmarks. The two walks pass through the same city streets. The two walks are, in this sense, the same walk with different points of pause. The civic outcome of having two walks is not reducible. Philadelphia in 2026 has two walks. The civic memory that arises from the two walks is two register. The civic memory of Philadelphia in 2026 is the memory of a city that is doing two kinds of civic memory work simultaneously. It is the memory of a city whose polished walk is doing the public memory work of remembering the founding. It is the memory of a city whose archival walk is doing the working memory work of widening the founding. The two works are not, in 2026, fully reconciled. They are, however, both done. both done by the two walks, by the same streets, by the same Philadelphia in 2026. The civic outcome of having two walks is finally that the city is doing the patient civic work of widening its own civic memory. The patient widening is not, in 2026, a finished project. The patient widening is a continuing project. The continuing project is, in its archival walk operations, what historians, archivists, librarians, and patient working visitors continue to do. The continuing project is, in its polished walk operations, what the National Park Service, the National Constitution Center, and the Independence Hall Association continue to do. The two are doing the work. The polished work is the easier work. The archival work is the harder work. Both are the work. Philadelphia in 2026 is a city that is both polishing and archiving at the same time. Both are doing the work. The city is, in 2026, a two-walk city. The two walks are the work. When the archival walker walks home, they are walking home with a memory that will, in 2 weeks, be quietly unshareable. They will not, in their normal conversations, be able to fluently transmit the archival Philadelphia memory. The archival Philadelphia memory is, in this sense, a quiet memory. The archival Philadelphia memory is the quiet archival grade memory of a city whose polished memory is more public. The archival Philadelphia memory is the working, patient, slow memory of a city that is doing two things. The polished walker walks home with the polished Philadelphia memory. The polished Philadelphia memory is fluent. The polished Philadelphia memory fits, in conversational terms, into the polished American civic memory. The archival walker, by contrast, walks home with a memory that does not, in conversational terms, fit. The archival Philadelphia memory is patient. The archival Philadelphia memory is quiet. The archival Philadelphia memory is the working register of the city. The two registers are, in conversational terms, unequal. The polished register is fluent. The archival register is quiet. The polished register is the register most Americans have of Philadelphia. The polished register is, in conversational terms, the register that allows Americans to talk about Philadelphia with the fluency of the schoolroom and the tour guide. The archival register is the register most Americans do not have of Philadelphia. The archival register is the register that, in conversational terms, is generally too quiet to easily carry into social memory. The two registers are, in 2026, the actual registers of Philadelphia. Both are doing the work. The patient archival walker, walking home, will not, in most cases, talk about the archivally walked Philadelphia. The archivally walked Philadelphia will, however, in their own quiet way, remain a part of their own thinking. The polished walker, walking home, will, in most cases, talk about the polished Philadelphia. The polished Philadelphia will, in their own more public way, become a contributor to the polished American civic memory. The two Philadelphias, walking home, walk home in different registers. The two registers are not, in absolute sense, equal. They are, however, in civic sense, deeply honest. The polished register is honest. The archival register is honest. Both are, in their own registers, Philadelphia. The city is, in 2026, both. Philadelphia is, finally in 2026, a city whose civic memory is honest in both registers. It is honest in the polished register. It is honest in the archival register. The polished register does not pretend to be the whole record. The polished register, by 2026, has begun to honestly include enough of the archival material that the polished register is no longer, in the dominant register of the city, a simple civic polish. The archival register does not, in 2026, pretend to displace the polished register. The archival register is doing its working patient work. The archival register is not, in 2026, in any particular hurry to displace the polished register. The two registers are, in 2026, on a slow convergence path. The slow convergence is not, in 2026, a fast, reconciled civic story. The slow convergence is, in 2026, a long historical work. The long historical work is, in 2026, what Philadelphia is doing. The long historical work is, in 2026, what Philadelphia has been doing in some form since 1980. The long historical work is, in 2026, slowly working. The two registers are, in 2026, doing the work. The city is, in 2026, the honest two-register city. It is a city whose civic memory in both registers is, in 2026, more honest than it has ever been. This is the Philadelphia that 2 centuries of patient archival work has built. This is the Philadelphia that the polished civic memory has, in 2026, also begun to honor. This is the Philadelphia that we walk through. This is the Philadelphia that the polished schoolroom history textbook is, by 2026, slowly widening to honor. This is Philadelphia. Both registers, both honest, both remembered, both are this city. One of them, soft enough to walk into. Philadelphia will, in the next 20 to 50 years, continue to do what Philadelphia has been doing since 1980. Philadelphia will continue to slowly widen its civic memory in small, patient, archival-grade civic memory additions. The polished walk will, in the next 20 to 50 years, continue to be the polished walk. The archival walk will, in the next 20 to 50 years, continue to be the archival walk. The partnership between the polished walk and the archival walk is not, in 2026, a single civic program. The partnership is, in 2026, a slow two-track civic memory practice. The first track is the polished walk. The polished walk is the federal and city civically organized walk. The polished walk is what the National Park Service runs. The polished walk is what the Independence Hall Association runs. The polished walk is what the National Constitution Center runs. The polished walk is the walk that is most Philadelphians and most visitors experience as Philadelphia. The second track is the archival walk. The archival walk is the patient, working, institutional walk. The archival walk is what the American Philosophical Society runs. The archival walk is what the Historical Society of Pennsylvania runs. The archival walk is what the various denominational archives run. The archival walk is what the African American Museum in Philadelphia runs. The two tracks are, in 2026, the work Philadelphia is doing. Both tracks will continue into the future. Both tracks are honest. Both tracks are doing their respective civic work. The polished track will, in 2026, continue to widen its interpretive signage to include more archival material. The archival track will, in 2026, continue to host its patient working researchers. The two tracks are, in fact, the same work done in two registers. The same work is the widening of Philadelphia's civic memory to include, in its public-facing polished register, more of the archival record that has, for 2 centuries, been quietly held in the city's archives. The widening is, in 2026, a continuing process. It will not, in any finite prediction, end. The polishing of polished and the widening of archival will continue together for the foreseeable future because the city has both registers. The city has both registers. Both registers are doing their work. The two registers are, in 2026, the two registers Philadelphia is using to do its civic memory work. This is what makes Philadelphia a different kind of founding-era city. Philadelphia is not, in this sense, like Boston, like Williamsburg, like Annapolis. Philadelphia is instead the founding-era city that has, in 2026, the largest publicly accessible archival civic memory register and the largest polished history visitor register. The polished register is at the Liberty Bell Center, the Independence Hall Pavilion, the National Constitution Center. The archival register is at the American Philosophical Society, the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, the African American Museum in Philadelphia. The two registers are doing the work. Both registers are the work. What they do together, in this sense, is the continuous widening of the city's civic memory. The city has, in 2026, the room for both. The room is the polished and archival public square, the polished and archival block, the polished and archival city. The room is the city. The city has the room. The room is, in fact, the city. Philadelphia is, in this sense, an honest two-register founding-era city. The two registers are doing the work. The work is, in 2026, the unwritten civic history that Philadelphia is gradually, patiently, archivally doing. This is the Philadelphia of this script. This is the Philadelphia that the patient archival walker walks home with. This is the Philadelphia that has both registers. This is the Philadelphia that 2 centuries of patient walking has slowly built. One of them soft enough to walk into.